From the St. Francis Yacht Club in San Francisco, this is the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, hosted by Ron Young.
Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from the virtual grill room of the St. Francis Yacht Club. Our speaker today hails from the Chicagoland area, where she got a BA in anthropology from the University of Illinois, Chicago. Then she went on to get a master's degree in anthropological archaeology from University of Kansas. And then she got a master's degree in museum studies from my own alma mater, San Francisco State. She came to the Bay Area in 2006 until 2011, worked with my one-time colleague and terrific, really brilliant guy, Jim Allen. From 2012 until 2022, our speaker today was executive director of the Richmond Museum of History and Culture. And beginning in January of 2022, she became executive director of the Vallejo Naval and History Museum. With all of that, Melinda, thanks so much for speaking with us and welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Many Bay Area sailors know Vallejo because we go sailing to Vallejo in what was for many years the biggest race in Northern California, the Vallejo race. And it would be an incredibly wild 200, sometimes 300 boats go to the otherwise docile town of Vallejo, and we would fill up the harbor. And it's a beautiful place. Most people don't know that Vallejo has lots of historical significance. The first time an airplane took off from a ship, it was a Vallejo-based prototype that took off from San Francisco Bay, north of Treasure Island. And it was really an experiment out of Mare Island. So tell us all about the Vallejo Naval and History Museum.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. And those interesting tidbits of history. You're absolutely right about the first aircraft carrier originated from Mare Island. And in fact, we have a model of that ship and aircraft in our museum. And actually it's going on loan to Vacaville just pretty shortly, because there's an exhibit on aviation and that's going to be opening soon in Vacaville. Not only did we build a lot of ships during World War II, but the Mare Island Naval Shipyard was the first naval base on the West Coast. So it was founded in 1854. I'm going to do some history of the Mare Island Naval Shipyard. I can't say I'm going to do everything. I'm basically going to highlight just a couple of the many ships in Vallejo at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard, as I like to call it, MINSI, because that's the acronym. So I call the presentation a new chapter for your community museum, because of course we are a small local history museum. We tend to be more on the modest side than some of the museums that you would find, let's say, in San Francisco. On the other hand, that gives us an opportunity to be really personal. We don't necessarily want to replicate what a big museum does. We want to build on the strengths of being a small museum and being really personal and providing people a really personal experience. And the reason why it's a new chapter for our museum is because I am the first new director at the Vallejo Naval and Historical Museum for the first time in 33 years. The individual who worked here before me, he's wonderful. His name is Jim Kern. He retired at the end of last year after being at the helm, pun intended, for literally 33 years. And that is a very long time to be in one position and to run an organization. And so it is a new chapter because we have a new director, we are looking forward, and you will find that I am very enthusiastic and I am very ambitious. When my friend Armand suggested that I be a speaker at the St. Francis Yacht Club, I said, absolutely, I would love to do that. A little bit about myself. I started practicing archaeology in the year 2000. So I actually worked in archaeology for about 11 years. I did archaeology all over the United States and Europe. I was very, very lucky and fortunate to conduct excavations in one of the painted caves in France. It's called Gargas Cave. I really wanted to be more in the educational realm of history, people, culture, and that is why I returned to school and earned my technical degree at San Francisco State. And while I was at San Francisco State, I got an internship at the Richmond Museum, and less than 6 months later, after being an intern, I was the executive director. It was a very short trajectory from getting into the program to then running and managing and administering museums. I am very happy and I'm proud to be in this position that I'm in. This is a photograph of me. You will see behind me, there is a large mural. It was a mural by a fella named Victor Ardatoff. It was considered lost, and I got a fly in my bonnet to find it. And in fact, I did find it, and I raised $60,000, $50 and $100 at a time. And I had it restored, and it is now hanging in the Richmond Museum, hopefully forever. Victor Ardatoff is a really well-known artist, particularly right now, because his work is under a lot of controversy at George Washington High School. If you'll remember, there's a bunch of controversy about the murals at George Washington High School and whether they're going to cover them or tear them down. If this is new to you, then look it up because it is quite interesting. Another thing about Victor is that he is in fact Ukrainian, or he was Ukrainian. So my research interest today, I haven't mentioned yet, but I'm also a professor. So I am a professor of anthropology at Contra Costa College, which I'm, again, very proud to be a professor. I make a lot of jokes that being a professor is my side hustle, as many of that's what the young kids are calling it today. So I work full time, and then I also teach classes. One thing that I'm super interested in is indigenous sovereignty and women-led movements, right? And that's why I have this basket up here, is because I'm a big supporter of the Ohlone people. And a good friend of mine, Karina Gould, she runs an organization called Sogorea Te Land Trust. And she is working to, as she calls it, rematriate the land. And my personal philosophy is social justice through education. So education is the big equalizer. And once you learn about something, it's no longer scary. And I work to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to learn, right, and explore their world. Vallejo Naval and Historical Museum is a community museum. Local history is important because it demonstrates that extraordinary things have happened in your own community, and it inspires you to do the same in your own life. And yes, we have a lot of wonderful historical figures, the George Washingtons and Benjamin Franklins and Eleanor Roosevelts and Harriet Tubman, who's one of my favorites. Sometimes those figures seem a little out of reach. And so what I look for when I'm telling stories is the ordinary extraordinaries. And those individuals who maybe didn't realize that they were doing something very wonderful during their lifetime. They were just trying to be the change that they wanted to see in the world. The men who were the first people to go on submarines. Imagine being told, you're going to take this ship underwater. For millennia, we've been trying to avoid taking ships underwater. Now we're going to go ahead and just do that, and I'm going to ask you to be the first. So these people who honestly didn't recognize that they were living extraordinary lives, the average everyday person who walks into my museum, wherever it is going to be able to see themselves reflected in that story and ask themselves, hopefully, how can I do something like that? How can I live my best life and be extraordinary? One of those ordinary extraordinaries is a gentleman named Freddie Meeks. And Freddie Meeks was one of the survivors from the Port Chicago explosion. Freddie Meeks was an individual who was loading ammunition onto a carrier ship in what is now Concord. The ship exploded, and then Freddie Meeks and 50 other African-American sailors from Port Chicago organized a work stoppage, and that was called a mutiny, and they were put in a jail here in Mare Island. He was pardoned by Clinton, but there's a whole effort to exonerate him. What was happening is Freddie Meeks was really standing up to injustice and to an unsafe working environment. Today, we are looking at his story with new eyes and saying how brave he was. At the time, he was labeled a mutinous, he was labeled as a traitor, and today, that narrative has changed. So I want to tell you a little bit about some of the things that we've done in the museum since the time that I started here. We have concerts, we talk about local sports, we have comedy shows. The museum actually has a theater upstairs. We put on performances, we put on a lot of recitals, and then we also put on musical theater. So we did Matilda recently. We have local company that we are entering into an agreement with, who is going to be our resident company for the next couple years, which is exciting. And then finally, many of you would recall the Zodiac murders. 4 of the murders or more were centered around Vallejo. And so there's a new trilogy of books, and we had a speaker here about the Zodiac killer. We are housed in the 1927 Beaux Arts style building, and I'm sitting right now in the former mayor/city manager's office. The building's on the National Register, State Register, etc. It's got 35,000 square feet of exhibit space. We have a permanent exhibit based in Vallejo, an exhibit about Mare Island, an event space, and as I said, a theater. So I want to tell you a little bit about what's upcoming at the museum. I'm really excited that we have a exhibition exploring the contributions of Hispanics and Latinos in Vallejo. We are doing a really unique program about African Americans in the gold rush. So how many of you learned about African Americans in the gold rush? Because I learned very little about them. And in fact, they were there and they made big contributions. And it took a lot of detailed research, but this fella named Mark Oliver and one of my personal friends, Sharon McGriff Payne, wrote a book called Voices of the Golden Ghost, exploring the contributions of African Americans in the gold rush. And then something that I'm really proud of is that the Vallejo Museum is one of the oldest arts and culture organizations in the community. And as a result, we are taking our place as the leader of nonprofits in Vallejo. And as you can see, we are co-hosting a nonprofit mixer. So Mare Island right now has a fantastic brewery, and you can come and you can have a Saginaw beer, and you can look at all kinds of Mare Island memorabilia. This whole line of beers is all based on Mare Island, and it's the coal sheds. So literally on the island where they stored all the coal has now been turned into a brewery. And I know we can all understand that because, right, breweries are very exciting. So we are having a fundraiser upcoming, and I want everyone to come. So please come out to Vallejo, have some beers at the Mare Island Brewery, and then come to our fundraiser. It's going to be super fun. And so it's October 15th, and we are celebrating the 1960s. The 60s was a period of deep division in our country, right? It was a time of change. It was a time of transition. Right. And we're exploring the 1960s, not only to celebrate all the wonderful music and culture that came out of the 1960s. Reagan was governor, JFK was president, there was the March on Washington, so many exciting things happening. But we're also looking back to the 60s to say, hey, that was another time when America was truly divided. I mean, think about Vietnam. So we have been through these divisions before, and we will emerge stronger, just like we did in the 1960s. We are going into our vaults, and we are creating a short film that illustrates life in Vallejo in the 1960s. So it's going to be really fun. Instead of having a speaker, we are going through and we're digitizing all of our 8mm film.
So let me ask you a question. Vallejo was also the capital of California in 1852 and 1853. It was one of 6 cities that were capital other than Sacramento and before Sacramento, San Francisco being one of those. In 1862, San Francisco became the capital during the flooding of Sacramento. The rivers overflowed in the California Delta, and literally the legislature had to move out of Sacramento, move down to San Francisco to the Merchants Exchange Building, as I recall. So you guys also were one of the genuine capitals, not just a temporary capital like San Francisco was during Sacramento, but you were a genuine capital for a couple of years. So do you cover that as well in your museum?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for bringing that up. As you mentioned, it's a short period. We cover very briefly the capital of Vallejo in our South Gallery in our permanent exhibition. Vallejo was the capital. The problem with Vallejo was that there were not a lot of services in Vallejo at the time. And so the state assembly was not happy with Vallejo as the town. And so they moved it over to Benicia. I believe one of the more important things that took place during that period was the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act in California. So another wonderful thing that I personally very proud of, because we want to make sure that we are accessible to everyone, is we have a family free day. So our free day takes place every third Saturday of the month. And we're also doing story time, one of the local agencies, and we give away books and snacks and things to young families. We also are now doing programming during that time to make it more attractive and also to make sure that everybody feels welcome in our museum. Vallejo at one time was, not very long ago, voted one of the most diverse cities in the United States. And that's not just ethnic diversity, it's also socioeconomic diversity. And so there are a lot of people who struggle around recreational activities, particularly now. And so I'm really glad that we can provide this type of educational programming for families totally free of charge. So I wrote a grant for this and I got money. I'm being supported by local agencies. And at the same time, I'm buying all of our materials from the local bookstore. You know, I'm really making sure that we are very Vallejo centric. Our upcoming plans are, we are going to increase our K through 12 field trip program. I'm working on another grant right now. I'm going through the process for a K through 12 field trip program, not just for a museum educator, but also to provide bus transportation to these students, because it is impossible for the schools to pay for buses. Buses are really expensive, and the Vallejo Unified School District just can't afford it. If you might remember, Vallejo has not been as fiscally responsible over the last couple decades. I had those experiences of field trips. I want to give those experiences to others. We also have a beautiful event space. This was a wedding that took place in our event space, this image here. And, you know, we want to rent our event space. We want to renovate our theater. We also want to renovate our permanent exhibit. And that's another big thing that we're working on, is raising money. I spend the most time in my position, as I should be, raising money, because we are a nonprofit. I'm going to a very, very brief history of the Mare Island Naval Shipyard, because there's so much. I'm referencing a book called Side Wheelers to Nuclear Power by Sue Lemon and E.D. Witchels. So those of you who are interested in learning a little bit more about the history of Mare Island, this is really an encyclopedic book. It's not necessarily a narrative style written book. We're still waiting for that one. So I invite you all to write that book, please. If this piques your interest at all, then I suggest you get this book. The Mare Island Shipyard, and this is a very early image, was actually founded or established in 1852 as a floating dry dock. So we have the first floating dry dock for Mare Island was established almost immediately after California was brought into the Union. It was actually a repair shop. We weren't building ships quite yet. That happened really soon after. So the formal founding of Mare Island Naval Shipyard was 1854, and in fact was the first American naval base on the West Coast. And the first ship that we launched under the command of Admiral Farragut, this is him right here, was the Saginaw. And the Saginaw, of course, has a lot of maritime history lore surrounding it because it wrecked on a reef at Ocean Island, right around Hawaii. And the crew had to set out they actually took one of the gigs, the captain's gig, fitted it with some sailing equipment, and then went to get help. Right? They went to get help and they reached Kauai and then were able to get back and rescue some of the other individuals that were on Ocean Island. And that captain's gig still exists. It was on exhibit in Saginaw, Michigan for the longest time. Just like I had got a fly in my bonnet about that mural that I talked about, I have a fly in my bonnet to bring that captain's gig back to Mare Island, Vallejo, California, because it needs to be here. If it's not on display somewhere on the East Coast, then it needs to come back to Vallejo. And I could do that, I could request that loan. I just got to figure out some way to transport it out here and also pay for that. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have that captain's gig back here 163 years after we launched it in Mare Island? During World War I, we built a bunch of destroyers. This is, I believe, the Shaw. And the Shaw was the first of the destroyers that were launched here in Mare Island during World War I. 16 of these four pipers, as they are called, because of these four pipes, were actually built here in Mare Island. And this, from what I can remember, the Shaw was actually also, it was in a naval battle. And this is a artist rendition of what the Shaw looked like after the battle. It actually was sailed back to the United States backwards after it got into this battle. One of the tall ships, which were built here in Mare Island, we started to get into these destroyers, and the quintessential type of destroyer that we built were these four pipes. Okay, so another extremely famous ship that we have built here in Mare Island was the California. So the California was the only battleship that was ever launched at Mare Island in 1919. And it is the largest ship ever built on the Pacific coast.
World War I's ending in 1919.
Well, it's true, but at that time we were sowing our wild oats when it came to the Pacific Ocean. So the United States was looking to defend the territory. A lot of the manifest destiny when it comes to the Pacific Ocean, really defending this, our newfound role as a world leader. And it is interesting that it was only after the war that the battleship was built. However, two things. Number one, I can't tell you actually when it was started. It may have been started during the war, because the war was so short for the United States. And this is something that I always find interesting. In Europe, they just call it the Great War. They don't really break it up between World War I and World War II. So there was a short period of time when the United States wasn't formally at war, but in fact, there was still a lot of tension.
There were a couple of different Californians, as we know. This is one of the Californians. Is that correct, Melinda?
That is correct. This is the BB-44. That's the naval designation. It was actually launched in 1919, although I believe the keel may have been laid in 1916. Probably one of the more interesting aspects of the life of the California was that it was at Pearl Harbor. So it sustained several bombs during the attack on Pearl Harbor, and it was eventually scrapped in 1947. Okay, so the USS Chicago, which is so close to my heart, that's where I was from, was launched in 1930. And she was also operating out of Pearl Harbor at the beginning of World War II. And she saw action at the Solomon Islands and also Guadalcanal, which was a terrifying, horrific naval battle in World War II. And I know a little bit about that through my work at the Richmond Museum, because a couple Richmond ships were also at Guadalcanal. The Chicago did go back to Mare Island and was repaired and then rejoined the fleet, but again came under attack, etc., etc. She sank. The Chicago, another ship that was built in Mare Island, launched in 1930 and saw a lot of action in World War II. The USS Nautilus has the distinction of being the first submarine that was built and launched at Mare Island. So originally named the Nautilus, it was redesignated as the V6, but then redesignated as SS-168. The Nautilus, again, was launched in 1930. The keel was laid in 27, and she saw a lot of action during World War II. She made 14 war patrols in enemy waters, and she sank 6 ships. She was decommissioned in 1945 with all honors, and they actually blooded the keel, if you will, with champagne during her decommissioning as an honor for her. But the first United States submarine, the Nautilus, or also SS-168, was in fact built and launched from Mare Island. And the USS San Francisco. So again, this may be one of several USS San Franciscos because ships were named and renamed over time. This was launched in the 1930s. A nice little historical fact, christened with water from the newly completed Hetch Hetchy Dam. So that's it. Rather than using a bottle of champagne, the powers that be brought up some water from Hetch Hetchy, which, you know, we all know about. So she was a heavy cruiser. She was equipped with 9 8-inch guns and 8 5-inch guns. So she was a heavy cruiser. She was equipped with, a series of defense guns. She played a decisive role in the Second Battle of the Kula Gulf in 1942. She was severely damaged, and her life of battle pretty much ended at that time. And she's now, as of the 1960s, part of the historical monument at Land's End in San Francisco.
And she was awarded like 17 battle stars in a presidential unit citation. She was one of the most decorated ships in World War II, literally.
Oh, that's so beautiful. So one of the most decorated ships of World War II, and now part of our historical monument. So the Silver Sides was a fleet type submarine that was built in Mare Island. And this ship was actually built during World War II, and it was launched in 1941. The Silver Sides was one of the most decorated, had the top submarine combat record in the Pacific, and was the third in ships sunk, 23, and fifth in the amount of tonnage that was sunk, 90,000 tons. Third in the number of ships sunk, and the other two, number 1 and 2, also Mare Island ships. So 1, 2, and 3 in terms of submarines with highest number of ships sunk during World War II were all from Mare Island. She was, after the war, towed up the Mississippi River and brought up to Great Lakes Naval Training Station. She was an attraction on the Chicago waterfront, and now she has her own museum in Michigan. So if anybody has been to the Silver Sides Museum, I'd love to know a little bit more about that because it sounds fascinating. And now we're getting into the nuclear age. The beginning of nuclear submarines at Mare Island was the Theodore Roosevelt. And this was SSBN 600. And the Theodore Roosevelt was the first of 7 Mare Island built nuclear powered Polaris missile-firing submarines. It was launched in 1959 at the height of the Cold War, and actually sponsored by the daughter of Theodore Roosevelt, the woman who cracked the champagne bottle. It was for a very long time considered to be the fleet's finest submarine. So this enters in or ushers in our era of nuclear submarines. And then finally, everybody's favorite submarine in Vallejo is the Vallejo. In 1966, the Vallejo was launched and to a huge fanfare and a huge party. There is a great deal of film about the Vallejo submarine. We have a variety of different types of commemorative materials in our own museum about it. And I believe that part of it is on display at the temporarily closed Mare Island Museum. We are all hoping collectively as a community that the Mare Island Museum will reopen sooner rather than later. The Vallejo was kind of the pinnacle, you could call it the capstone project of Mare Island. And after the nuclear submarine, it's my understanding that the Mare Island shipyard moved more into repairing and maintaining ships. We stopped building and launching ships. It was in 1996 that Bill Clinton closed Mare Island. Today, Mare Island is a tourist destination. You can see wonderful things there, like a lot of the original buildings. You can have locally brewed beer with the Mare Island Brewing. You can have locally distilled whiskey with the salvage and freight. And you can visit beautiful places like St. Peter's Chapel, I believe is the oldest naval chapel on the West Coast. The first mass was said there in 1901, and it has a series of outstanding and phenomenal Tiffany windows. And this is just scratching the surface of the history of Mare Island and in the naval history of Vallejo, because, we had ferries here. There was a variety of maritime based industries, if you will. Finishing up and coming to the end of my talk, we would love to have you in Vallejo. You would be surprised. There's a lot to do here. I know Vallejo, and I'm just going to say it, Vallejo does not get the best coverage in the news, but at the same time, that's not all that Vallejo is. I suggest coming to Vallejo when you're on your way to Tahoe. That would be a great time to come to Vallejo. We have a fantastic art walk that happens first Fridays. Vallejo has become what's known today as Berkeley and San Francisco artist refugee community. Those individuals who have been priced out, San Francisco and Berkeley and Oakland, have now moved up to Vallejo, and there really is a very interesting enclave of artists. So please feel free to give me an email, give me a call, or simply drop by. We are open Tuesday through Friday from 12 to 4 and Saturday from 10 to 4. So I want to thank you so much for giving me your time today. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope this inspires you to learn a little bit more about Vallejo and Mare Island.
Well, all the way from the General Vallejo, famous founder of the City of Vallejo, to the modern Vallejo Naval and Historical Museum. We're quite happy to reflect on the cool credentials of Vallejo and the naval history of Vallejo. And thanks very much for Melinda for championing it and being our guest on the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. Thank you.
Right. And I want to thank Armand as well for suggesting me as a speaker. So thank you to him.
Thanks so much. Okay.
Have a great one.
This has been a presentation of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.